At dawn, the fog rolled down from the mountains like a living thing, wrapping itself around the silent homes of Deren. The birds that once greeted the sunrise with their songs did not stir. The dogs barked at nothing, and by the time the first outsider arrived, there was no one left to hear them. The year was 1979. Deren, a small farming village tucked deep within the Karakoram foothills, had always existed quietly, unnoticed by the wider world. It was the kind of place where generations lived and died without ever leaving, where the rhythm of life was measured by the sound of rivers, bells, and prayers carried by the wind. But that morning, the world seemed to stop breathing. A traveling merchant named Hassan was the first to find the village. He had been coming there for 10 years, trading salt and fabric for grain and wool. He expected the usual scene: children chasing each other near the well, women washing clothes by the stream, and the smell of bread baking in clay ovens. But as he entered the village square, he felt something was off. There was no movement, no voices. A door creaked in the wind, the only sound breaking the silence. He called out, thinking perhaps everyone had gathered in the fields, but his voice only echoed back. When he entered the first house, what he saw froze him in place. A kettle sat on the fire, water still warm. Bowls of half-eaten food rested on the table. The chairs were pulled out as if people had just stood up and walked away. Every home told the same story: abandonment without warning. Hassan ran to the small mosque at the edge of the village. The prayer mats were neatly laid, shoes lined up at the door. No signs of struggle, no footprints in the mud leading away. It was as if 312 people had vanished into thin air. When news reached the nearby district, the authorities assumed it was an evacuation gone wrong. Perhaps a landslide warning, perhaps a disease outbreak. A search team was sent in. But when they arrived, they too were struck by the eerie stillness. Fire still burned in hearths. Milk sat curdled in pots. Even the livestock had not strayed far, as if waiting for their owners to return. Investigators began to document the scene carefully, but the deeper they looked, the stranger it became. Every clock in the village had stopped, exactly at 3:07 a.m. There was no sign of forced departure, no footprints in or out, no signs of struggle or resistance. Even the village's only truck still sat by the road, key in the ignition, as if someone had meant to leave and then didn't. The mystery of Deren quickly spread beyond the mountains. Journalists, scientists, and spiritual leaders all came with their own theories. But before the world could even begin to understand what had happened, the village was sealed off by government order. Officially, it was declared unsafe due to environmental instability. Unofficially, it was treated like a ghost site. Yet Deren was not the first village in history to disappear under strange circumstances. In different corners of the world, similar vanishings have been recorded, entire populations gone, leaving behind lives frozen in time. Anthropologists have long studied such cases, trying to understand what drives human groups to abandon their homes overnight. In most cases, the reasons are natural: famine, disease, war, or migration. But what makes Deren's case different is the lack of any of these factors. There was no warning, no disaster, no evidence of movement. What happens in a community when fear takes hold at a collective level? Psychologists studying historical disappearances suggest that mass hysteria or shared hallucination can sometimes drive whole groups to act irrationally, especially when isolated and exposed to environmental stress. A sudden sound, a strange light, or an unexplained tremor can trigger panic that spreads faster than reason. And in close-knit societies, once one person runs, the rest often follow. But in Deren, even panic seemed absent. The homes were too orderly. There was no sign of a rush. The only clue, those stopped clocks, hinted that something happened in the dead of night. Quietly, universally, and all at once. The story of Deren became more than a local mystery. It became a study in how humans cope with the unknown. When people cannot find logical answers, they build explanations out of imagination and fear. Legends began to form almost immediately. Some claimed the villagers had angered the mountain spirits. Others whispered of alien abduction or divine punishment. The lack of evidence became the perfect canvas for myth. From an educational point of view, Deren teaches how collective mysteries shape culture. Communities create stories not just to explain what happened, but to protect themselves from uncertainty. Every generation that heard of Deren added its own version, turning fact into folklore. Yet underneath the myths lies a deeper truth about how fragile our sense of safety really is. Imagine everything familiar, your home, your neighbors, your family, suddenly gone without warning or reason. Deren's silence forces us to confront a universal fear, that life can vanish as easily as it appears. Whether caused by nature, psychology, or something humanity has yet to understand, the disappearance of Deren reminds us that behind every mystery is a mirror reflecting our own struggle to make sense of the world. And while no one ever found the villagers, no graves, no bodies, no clues beyond those ticking clocks, the name Deren still appears on old maps, like a scar that refuses to fade. It stands as a lesson that the unknown isn't always hidden in distant galaxies or ancient myths. Sometimes it's right here on Earth, waiting quietly in the fog. When investigators first entered Deren, they expected chaos, signs of struggle, broken furniture, and overturned belongings. Instead, they found order. Every house stood as if its occupants had simply stepped out for a moment. The floors were swept, dishes were clean, and beds were made. It was the small details that unsettled them most. A bowl of porridge still steamed faintly on a table, though no fire burned beneath it. A half-written letter sat on a desk, the ink barely dry. Toys were scattered near the well, as if children had been playing only minutes before they vanished. The official search team began their work methodically, documenting everything. What they discovered painted a chilling picture of a single moment frozen in time. Each clock in Deren, wall clocks, wristwatches, and even an old grandfather clock in the schoolhouse had stopped at 3:07 a.m. The precision of it ruled out coincidence. Investigators began to suspect that something had occurred at that exact hour, something powerful enough to halt daily life simultaneously. In forensic analysis, investigators are trained to read environments the same way detectives read faces. Every object, every disturbance tells part of a story. A cup tipped over might suggest panic. A locked door might mean someone felt threatened. But in Deren, the usual clues refused to align. There were no overturned chairs, no spilled water, no signs of running or hiding. The only movement seemed to be the air that still carried the faint scent of smoke from burnt wood and bread. Some experts believed the villagers could have been exposed to a gas leak, carbon monoxide or methane, emanating from underground fissures common in mountainous terrain. Such gases can cause hallucinations, confusion, and loss of consciousness. But if that were the case, the investigators asked, why were there no bodies? The livestock were alive and unharmed. Even the birds nested peacefully in nearby trees. The air samples collected showed nothing unusual. Others turned to environmental clues. The surrounding forest showed no sign of disturbance. No landslides, no animal attack, no nearby river flood. The night sky on that date was clear according to old meteorological records, meaning no storm or lightning. The disappearance, whatever it was, had left no trace in nature either. That absence, the empty space where evidence should have been, became the most haunting detail of all. Anthropologists often say that in archaeology and forensic work, the absence of evidence can sometimes tell more than its presence. What's left behind, the stopped clocks, the unfinished tasks, can reveal how sudden an event was, how unprepared the people were. In Deren's case, it suggested a complete break in normal routine, as if something had interrupted the flow of life itself. One investigator's report noted that even the candles left burning in two houses had melted down naturally, meaning the homes were not abandoned in haste. This implied that the people had vanished all at once, silently, without time to react. The timeline they built from these small details indicated that within 5 to 10 minutes of 3:07 a.m., every living person had disappeared. Psychologists brought in to analyze the case began to study the phenomenon of collective behavior under stress. They compared Deren's disappearance to rare historical events where groups fled suddenly due to perceived danger. Mass hallucinations triggered by toxins, religious panic, or environmental stimuli. But Deren lacked any warning signs that could explain a unified flight response. There was no evidence of mass hysteria, no messages left behind, no single trigger event. The local authorities, unable to find leads, began to rely on folklore for clues. Elders from neighboring villages spoke of an old legend tied to Deren's valley, that the mountains were alive, and every few generations they reclaimed what belonged to them. The villagers were warned never to disturb certain areas near the riverbank where strange sounds echoed at night. Skeptics dismissed this as superstition, but oral traditions often preserve traces of forgotten natural hazards. Sometimes myths are built around real phenomena: a cave emitting toxic gases, a frequency that unsettles the human mind, or vibrations that trigger fear and flight. For researchers studying Deren years later, what remained of the village was not just an archaeological puzzle, but a psychological one. It showed how our environments carry stories even when people are gone. Every item left behind, utensils, tools, letters, and photographs, became an artifact of interrupted existence. The village itself turned into a museum of absence, teaching investigators to see patterns not in what was present, but in what was missing. In classrooms and research journals, Deren became a case study in the philosophy of evidence. How do we interpret silence? What does emptiness tell us? The investigation into Deren highlighted that understanding human disappearance requires more than physical clues. It demands empathy and imagination. By piecing together fragments of ordinary life, investigators tried to reconstruct the extraordinary moment when that life stopped. What they found in Deren was not just the mystery of a vanished population, but the story of humanity's deep desire to explain the inexplicable. When we look into a place where people once laughed, worked, and loved and find only stillness, we are reminded that history doesn't always end with answers. Sometimes it ends with questions that echo louder than any evidence could. Even decades later, when the last researchers packed their notebooks and cameras, Deren remained untouched. The wind still moved through its empty houses, carrying whispers of conversations that once filled the air. And though the clocks had long stopped ticking, their frozen hands still marked the moment time forgot to move forward. By the early 1980s, the mystery of Deren had become a national obsession. Journalists, scientists, priests, and conspiracy theorists all took turns trying to explain how an entire community could vanish overnight. Newspapers ran stories with headlines like "The Village That Time Erased" and "The Karakoram Disappearance, Curse or Conspiracy." The official investigation had gone silent, which only deepened the public's hunger for answers. In the absence of truth, speculation became its own kind of evidence. The first wave of theories came from the scientific community. Geologists suggested that the ground beneath Deren might have shifted during the night. The region was known for minor seismic activity, and they proposed that a sudden sinkhole or fissure could have swallowed part of the village, leaving behind the surface structures intact but hollow underneath. However, detailed ground scans later showed no signs of collapse or subterranean cavities. The earth beneath Deren was firm, unchanged. Next came the environmental theory. Some scientists pointed to the possibility of toxic gas emissions. The nearby valley contained pockets of natural methane trapped underground. If a sudden release had occurred, it might have filled the village, suffocating the people in their sleep. But again, the physical evidence refused to cooperate. No remains were found, no animal deaths, and no environmental residue to support the claim. The theory was shelved, though it left behind one unsettling question. Could something invisible have passed through that night? Something that left no trace but silence? As science struggled for answers, the supernatural explanations gained ground. Local villagers believed Deren had been cursed long before its disappearance. According to legend, the settlement was built near a forbidden area, a part of the mountain believed to be home to the sleep spirits, beings that punished those who disturbed the land after dark. It was said that every few generations, the spirits would call back the living, taking them into the mountains to dwell between worlds. For the older residents of nearby towns, this legend wasn't fantasy. It was history. They recalled strange lights in the valley on winter nights, and the low hum that sometimes echoed through the gorge when the wind was still. When the Deren tragedy occurred, many were convinced the spirits had finally collected what was owed. These beliefs, while dismissed by scientists, carried cultural weight. In traditional societies, myth often serves as both explanation and warning, a way to keep people respectful of forces they cannot control or understand. But myths were not the only non-scientific theories. UFO enthusiasts quickly seized on the case. Reports surfaced of strange circular patterns burned into the ground near Deren's western edge. Some claimed to have seen bright lights hovering in the sky the night before the disappearance. A local shepherd swore he heard a humming sound that vibrated in his bones. Newspapers and late-night radio hosts built an entire narrative around this. An alien abduction, a government cover-up, and a silenced truth. It was sensational, profitable, and impossible to prove. Sociologists studying these reactions noticed a fascinating pattern. Whenever humanity faces an event that defies explanation, society tends to split between science and superstition, two ways of finding order in chaos. When logic fails to satisfy, belief steps in. And when belief falters, people look back to science, hoping it will restore a sense of control. The story of Deren became a case study in this psychological tug-of-war. Researchers at the National Psychological Institute later analyzed how rumors and collective imagination shaped public perception of the event. They found that within a year of the disappearance, over a dozen conflicting eyewitness accounts had appeared, even though no one had actually been in the village that night. This phenomenon, known as memory contagion, shows how shared storytelling can create false memories that spread like an infection. People begin to remember what they never saw because they've heard it described so vividly. At its core, this was not just about a missing village. It was about how humans respond to uncertainty. When faced with something they can't understand, people build narratives that make emotional sense, even if they defy logic. Myths, after all, are not lies. They are frameworks for meaning. They transform confusion into comprehension. The clash between science and superstition around Deren's disappearance reflected something deeper: our discomfort with ambiguity. We want every story to have a beginning, middle, and end, to fit neatly within the boundaries of cause and effect. But Deren resisted that structure. It existed as a question mark, and people's minds filled in the blanks in whatever way matched their worldview. Even decades later, the debate continued. Some university teams returned to Deren in the 1990s with advanced instruments, geological sensors, radiation detectors, and electromagnetic scanners. They found no definitive answers, but one detail caught their attention. Near the village's center, they recorded low-frequency vibrations that were barely audible but measurable. The data suggested a continuous hum in the 19 Hz range, below the threshold of normal human hearing. To the scientists, it was an interesting geological curiosity. To the villagers, it was proof of the mountain's voice. That discovery bridged the divide in an unexpected way. It revealed how science and superstition often describe the same phenomenon in different languages. Where one sees data, the other sees warning. Both seek understanding, both try to name the unknown. The story of Deren's theories, ranging from earthquakes to aliens, teaches a timeless lesson. When people encounter mystery, they reveal as much about themselves as about the event. The disappearance of Deren may remain unexplained, but the human reaction to it, our need to reason, to fear, to believe, tells its own story. It's not just a mystery of what happened to a village, but what happens to our minds when reason meets the limits of understanding. Years passed, and Deren slowly faded from the news cycle. The government sealed the area off, labeling it a restricted environmental zone. Few dared to question why. The official explanation, geological instability, was vague enough to quiet public curiosity. The road leading into the valley was blocked, maps were updated to mark it as uninhabited, and the story became another unsolved legend filed away in old newspapers. But then, decades later, something unexpected surfaced. In 1998, a journalist named Amir Jalil was researching declassified Cold War-era documents for a feature on abandoned military projects in Central and South Asia. Buried among pages of faded reports, he stumbled upon references to a classified testing ground known as Site 47, located suspiciously close to the coordinates of Deren. The files mentioned low-frequency resonance trials conducted in 1978-1979, right before the village disappeared. The details were sparse, but the implications were unsettling. The documents described an experiment involving infrasound, sound waves below the range of human hearing, typically under 20 Hz. Though inaudible, these frequencies can have powerful physical and psychological effects. Extended exposure has been known to cause nausea, panic, hallucinations, and disorientation. At certain intensities, infrasound can even vibrate the human body's organs, inducing a sense of dread or fear. Scientists had once considered it for use in non-lethal crowd control or military signaling. Amir's discovery reignited the mystery. He visited the Deren Valley under the pretext of a nature survey, escorted by 2 guides from a nearby village. What he found matched the description from the old photos: stone homes still standing, everything preserved under a thin veil of dust. When he reached the heart of the village, he noticed something peculiar. The wind produced a deep, rhythmic hum as it passed between the cliffs. It was faint, almost like a vibration in the bones rather than a sound in the ears. This hum aligned eerily with the reports in the declassified files. According to scientists later consulted by Amir, the narrow valley could naturally amplify low-frequency sound waves, especially during temperature inversions at night. If the government had indeed been testing infrasound devices nearby, the echoes could have traveled miles right into Deren. The theory that followed was both scientific and tragic. It proposed that the villagers were exposed to intense infrasound in the early hours of that night. Such frequencies could have triggered overwhelming anxiety, confusion, or even mass panic. Under this influence, the human mind can experience distorted perception, hearing non-existent voices, seeing movement where there is none, or feeling compelled to flee from an invisible threat. In short, the villagers might have run from something that didn't exist. Forensic psychologists studying similar phenomena explained how the brain's primal instincts respond to fear. When exposed to certain low frequencies, the body reacts as though it senses danger even when none is visible. Heart rate increases, adrenaline floods the bloodstream, and logic shuts down. In a community as close-knit as Deren, panic would spread instantly. If one family bolted into the night, others would follow, believing something terrible was coming. The tragedy, if this theory is true, is that they may have fled into the mountains in confusion and perished in the wilderness, never to be found. The cold, rugged terrain surrounding Deren could easily conceal remains for decades. Snow, landslides, and wildlife would erase any trace within weeks. Amir's report was never officially acknowledged, but it circulated quietly among researchers. It suggested that Deren's disappearance was not supernatural at all. It was a side effect of human experimentation. The use of infrasound for psychological testing was known to have been explored by several nations during the Cold War, often under deep secrecy. In those days, remote areas were chosen for tests precisely because they were isolated, and because if something went wrong, no one would ask questions. This revelation reframed Deren's mystery from one of myth to one of ethics. It raised hard questions. How much should governments be allowed to experiment in the name of science? Who bears responsibility when progress costs innocent lives? And how do we uncover truth when decades of secrecy bury it under layers of denial? Scientists later confirmed that infrasound can be produced naturally too, by wind, earthquakes, or even ocean waves. But the precision of Deren's case, with all clocks stopping at the same time, suggested something more controlled. The stopped clocks, once a supernatural symbol, now seemed like evidence of a physical shock, perhaps a brief surge of electromagnetic interference caused by nearby equipment. In the years that followed, researchers revisited the site using modern sensors. They detected faint traces of residual electromagnetic activity near the village's center, but nothing conclusive. Still, it was enough to keep the theory alive. Deren became a case study not just in mystery, but in the unintended consequences of technology. Today, universities and ethics boards use Deren as a cautionary example in lectures about scientific responsibility. It illustrates how the pursuit of innovation, when stripped of transparency and oversight, can cross into moral darkness. The scientists who may have been behind Site 47 likely never intended to destroy a village. They wanted data, not death. But progress without accountability has always carried a price, and Deren paid it in silence. In the end, the story of Deren stopped being a question of what happened and became a question of why it was allowed to happen. The myths of spirits and aliens were replaced by a colder, more human truth, that sometimes the monsters behind our mysteries are not supernatural. They're the ones designing experiments in the name of discovery. Today, Deren exists only on old maps and in the memories of those who once lived nearby. The valley remains off-limits, its silence preserved like a monument to what humanity is capable of forgetting and what it should remember. No official record ever admitted fault. No public apology was issued. But those who studied the case over the years agree on one thing. Deren was not just a tragedy of disappearance. It was a lesson in how easily truth can vanish when power, secrecy, and ignorance meet. When researchers and historians revisit the story now, they focus less on the how of Deren's disappearance and more on the why. Why was there no investigation after the area was closed? Why did neighboring communities receive no answers? And why did so many choose to believe comforting myths instead of demanding accountability? These questions point to a larger issue: the collective willingness to look away when mystery becomes uncomfortable. In many ways, Deren represents the intersection of science, ethics, and human memory. When progress is pursued without transparency, it risks repeating the same mistakes that history warns against. The infrasound theory, whether fully proven or not, opened an ethical debate about scientific responsibility. How far should experimentation go when human lives may be at stake? How much secrecy should governments be allowed in the name of defense or development? Historians often draw parallels between Deren and other real-world cases where technology outpaced morality. From nuclear testing in civilian areas to chemical trials in remote villages, the mid-20th century was filled with quiet tragedies masked by the promise of innovation. Deren fits within that pattern, a small, isolated community treated as expendable in the pursuit of progress. Its disappearance became a metaphor for how entire groups can be erased from the record when they exist outside centers of power. But Deren also offers a psychological lesson. When a mystery cannot be solved, humans instinctively create stories to fill the void. For decades, the tale of Deren became folklore, a story told by campfires and passed between generations. Some saw it as a moral fable about respecting nature, others as a warning against tampering with unseen forces. Ironically, those myths may have kept the memory of the village alive far longer than official records ever would. The folklore gave the dead a voice that bureaucracy tried to silence. Educators and anthropologists now view Deren as a case study in how societies process trauma and loss. When factual history fails, cultural memory steps in. The same pattern appears across the world: disasters that become legends, victims who become ghosts, and tragedies that become taboos. In studying Deren, students learn how myth-making is not ignorance but survival. It is how communities protect the emotional truth of an event, even when the physical truth is denied. In universities, the Deren principle is sometimes discussed in classes on scientific ethics and sociology. The idea that the absence of transparency leads to the birth of myth. When information is hidden, people will invent their own explanations, and those stories often last longer than any official version. Deren reminds us that truth cannot remain buried forever. It will return, reshaped through stories until someone listens. Standing at what remains of Deren today, all that's left are stone outlines of homes and broken wells overtaken by weeds. Nature has reclaimed what humanity abandoned. Yet, in that silence, there's a powerful lesson about memory. Civilizations build monuments to remember wars and victories, but the greatest lessons often come from places like Deren, where no one remains to tell their own story. It teaches that history isn't just about what happened, but about who is allowed to be remembered. The tragedy of Deren is also a warning. Progress without reflection can erase what it seeks to improve. Knowledge without empathy can destroy what it means to be human. The lesson left behind by that quiet valley is not one of fear, but of responsibility to question authority. to demand transparency, and to protect truth before it disappears. Today, scientists continue to study low-frequency sound for communication and environmental research, but every lecture on the subject eventually circles back to Deren. It is invoked as a reminder of what happens when curiosity crosses the line into carelessness. The story's ending is not written in anger but in caution.